I have a skill set, and audiobook narration is not part of that skill set. I still answer the phone sometimes. As your readers probably know, I have a very high voice, so not very tall. So sometimes now, even when I answer the phone, people are like, "Can I speak to your mother?" Type of thing. So I do not have an audiobook narrator voice. No, I am lucky enough that the companies that I work for, they sort of provide narrator auditions or little clips, and then I get to listen to those, and then we kind of figure out together who we're going to hire. So Meet Me in Ivy Falls is dual POV, male and female, so I will have a male narrator and a female narrator who will do the dual POV. And then Nothing But Sky has an audiobook, and that's a single female POV, excuse me. So yeah, so no, I do not narrate audiobooks. No, that is not in my skill set.
Everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have somebody who's very true today on the podcast. We're only going to talk truth today because Amy True is on the podcast. How's that? Amy's a great author, and she's got some new things to talk about here on the show, which I'm excited about. And it's really hot where Amy is. So everybody, if everyone could just turn on your air conditioning right now for Amy, that would be very appreciated. Amy, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I will take any of the cool vibes because it is over 110 degrees here today. So yeah, I will take any sort of, temperature decrease that you can offer to me. That would be fantastic.
Okay. Well, if it was the winter, I would shovel up some snow and mail it to you.
Yeah.
But I don't have any right now.
That's the antithesis of this, right? Like, it's gorgeous here in December, and then where you live, you're like, I want to dig out. So it's a trade-off.
I can't find my car, and I have to go to work.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fun.
And it's like 70 degrees here and sunny at time. So yeah, it's a trade-off.
Okay. Have we mentioned where are you, Amy?
Arizona. Yeah, Arizona. Yeah, so desert girl. Desert girl. Yep.
Mm-hmm. There's nothing better than August in Phoenix to warm your heart.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it's just sort of off topic, but we've talked about this before. But like, there's a difference between like the southern heat, like Tennessee heat, which is warm, but it's like very humid and, it's very wet. And then just here, you just walk outside and you felt like you walked into the broiler because it's so dry. So as I say to people who ask me how I can live here in the summer, I just tell them, you go from your air-conditioned house to your air-conditioned car to your air-conditioned work, and then in the reverse on the way home. So you don't get to spend a lot of time outside. So it's unless you get up like really early in the morning to take a walk, which is like 5 a.m. and it's still like 90 degrees. So yeah.
My first trip to Phoenix was in August. Again, from an air-conditioned airport to a plane to an air-conditioned airport to those doors that lead out into the heat.
Yeah.
And I swear there were locals that were watching me and mocking me the entire time. Like, oh, here comes a Canadian. Let's watch this guy. Oh, he's melted.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit of a shock to the system, that's for sure.
I love it. Well, so everyone, welcome to the Weather Podcast, where we talk all things weather.
How did we get there?
I love it. No, it's great. It's good. So, Amy, you're an author. You've been writing. You've been doing stuff. How long have you been doing this? Like, what was your starting point?
So I was trained as a journalist. I went to college and graduated with a journalism degree. As part of my my degree, you had to actually do a bunch of writing. So like before you could graduate your senior year, you actually had to work on a newspaper and you had to do all this stuff. And knee deep into doing that and doing some internships and stuff like that. I was like, I love writing, but I don't really want to be a journalist because like the first job out of college would be like writing obituaries for the smallest paper in the world. And you'd have to have a second job because it doesn't pay anything. And I was like, oh, Lord, I love writing, but what else can I do? So I actually, the summer before my senior year, I actually worked in entertainment. I worked in Los Angeles. And that actually translated to a job right after I graduated. So I worked in entertainment for about a year and a half, and it just really like wasn't my vibe. Like I really liked the production part of it, but like the chaotic kind of like crazy celebrity part of it really wasn't for me. So I actually moved back to Arizona and started working in advertising and did some copywriting and stuff like that. And just was like, I was in my element because I could be creative and I really love to be creative. But, advertising is more about business writing and stuff like that. So it wasn't until I was a little bit older and I was having what I'd love to call a milestone birthday coming up. And I thought, I'm just going to try to write a book just for kicks. I'm just going to give myself a year until that big birthday. And I'm just going to challenge myself and see if I can write a book. And literally 72 hours before my birthday, I wrote the end on my first book. So it was sort of just started out as sort of a challenge to myself to see if I could actually do it. And then it just turned into this crazy passion of mine. Now, will that book that I wrote ever see the light of day? Absolutely not. I love to call it my starter book. It was the book that taught me that I needed to learn how to write dialogue and I needed to learn how to write internal narrative and all this kind of stuff. But once I wrote the end on that book, I was this is something I love and this is something I have to do. And it would take me writing about 4 more books before I actually got an agent and actually had my first book published. So it was a lot of work. It took me about, I'd say good 6 or 7 years before I actually got an agent. And then right around the 8-year mark is when my first book came out in 2018. So yeah, so it's been a long haul, but I wouldn't give it up for the world because I feel like I learned so much along the way.
Okay, great. I'm on your website while we're chatting. It's a great website, by the way. I love it. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
So I see here you do have a link for your books. So talk to me about Meet Me at Ivy Falls. Is Ivy Falls a place? I don't know.
It's a fictional place. You learn as a writer. You learn as a writer that if you make a fictional place, you can do with it whatever you want. If you write about a real place, you get reviews that be like, really? I don't think that street leads there. So as a writer, you can take real places. That's what I do with a lot of my books. I take real people or real places that I really love, and then I sort of just work them into a story. So Meet Me in Ivy Falls is actually an interesting story because I love to call it my palate cleanser book. So under the name Amy Trueblood, I write historical fiction. And my first 2 books, Nothing But Sky and Across a Broken Shore, historical fiction books, those, are totally different, animals as far as writing. You spend a lot of time researching. You spend a lot of time writing, trying to get your word count in, and then you find yourself stopping and having to fact check things. And it's just a whole totally different process and a way to approach a book. And so when I was done with Across a Broken Shore, I just knew I wanted to take a break. And I had this just idea simmering in the back of my head about this little small town. And so I just started writing it. And so I started writing it, just the first draft, playing with the first draft, in 2016. And then when I would take breaks from other books I was writing, I would go back to Ivy Falls just because it was my happy place. And it just so happened that as things shifted and I had an agent and we parted ways, and then I had a second agent and I lost that agent because of when we were in the pandemic, everything was shut down in publishing. And so she had to leave publishing. And so when I was talking to my third agent, she was asking me what I was writing, and I sent her Meet Me in Ivy Falls on a Friday, and she called me back on a Monday, and she was like, let's talk. I want to sell this book and all this kind of stuff. So it wasn't really something that was in the forefront of my mind. It was just a book that I just kept going back to because I loved the characters and the world so much. And yeah, so we ended up working on it and sending it out on sub, and we ended selling it as a 3-book deal. So it's going to be a series, and it's based on a small little town in Tennessee called Franklin. I lived in Nashville for 6 years and had some friends who lived in Franklin. It's just a really sweet kind of little burg, a little village. And I just fell in love with it. And I just have always just thought, I want to write a fictional story about a town that reminds me a lot of Franklin. So that's sort of how we got here.
Great. So shout out to our listeners in Franklin. Hey, a book all about your town. Come on, go buy the book, everyone. Should be mandatory reading for everyone in Franklin.
Yeah. Obviously, everything, everything in Ivy Falls is made up, but very much the small town feel and the vibe and just the friendly people and how wonderful people are is just something that was very inspiring to me.
Great. Okay. So can we take a pause for a second? You write under 2 different names. Mm-hmm. Is it kind of like you're your own ghostwriter in that you get to write in 2 different ways? Is that kind of how that works?
It's interesting because it sort of allows you to sort of make this schism change because My books are kind of officially considered YA historical, but they're way crossover. Like I have a lot of adult readers too. And so when we were talking about like an adult book, and my agent and I were talking about it, she's like, this is very different than your other brand, which is your historical fiction brand. So why don't we just, have you have another pen name and then we'll work off of that. The problem with that is, and I've seen a lot of people struggle with this, is when you have like two totally separate pen names, then you have to build a platform for both those names and you have to grow your audience for both those names. And I had already done so much for Amy Trueblood that I said, well, Amy True kind of sounds romantic and sounds like fun and all this kind of stuff. So I was able to sort of marry those two together. So I will write contemporary under Amy True. And then I actually have an adult historical book that's out on submission right now. And if that ends up selling, that will be under the Amy Trueblood name, just so I can kind of keep the two separate. But my books all have very much the same kind of feel. I always write really ambitious, strong, outspoken, opinionated female characters who tend to not always have typical jobs and always tend to sort of push back against like establishment type of things. And so even though I'm sort of writing in these two different worlds, I still kind of have that same sort of like feeling and brand to my and voice to my books.
Okay. And then so your historical fiction books, you have Nothing But Sky
Mm-hmm.
and Across a Broken Shore.
Right.
How different are these two books? Or how similar are they?
Yeah, so they're both based on, inspired by real women in history. That was sort of how I started out is, long story short, I was on a trip with my family to Chicago. We went to the Museum of Science and Industry, and there was, I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's a great, beautiful museum. But when you walk inside, there's like a biplane that's tethered to the ceiling. And that was just really like, wow, that's an achievement to do that. So I went upstairs to look at the biplane. I didn't realize that there was an actual female mannequin like hanging from the biplane. And I was like, oh, what is this? And so I went to the placard that was in front of the display, in front of the exhibit, and the name of the woman was Ethel Dare. And so I was like, oh, this sounds really cool. So I read about her, and she basically was a female wing walker in the 1920s. So basically she hung off planes for a living, like as part of like a flying circus. So I was like, okay, this, like my writer brain started going, right? The what if question. And so that night, when everybody was asleep, I got on my laptop and I started researching these 1920s women who basically, worked for these flying circuses and basically did all these daredevil stunts 500 feet in the air without a parachute. And I was sold. I was like, oh my gosh. And then I went on YouTube and discovered that a lot of black and white film of women actually doing this from the 20s existed. So I spent a lot of time on YouTube researching these women. And so the story of Nothing But Sky came to me. And so I wrote that just like in a flash and a fury. Like I was like, I just want to write this story. And so I wrote that and we sold it. And then my option book ended up being Across a Broken Shore. Again, it's inspired by a strong female woman in history, Dr. Lucy Wanzer, who was actually one of the first women west of the Rockies to get her medical degree. And she ended up having a very big influence in the San Francisco Medical Society. She ended up helping to found the first women and children's hospital in San Francisco. But just much like Ethel Dare and Lillian Boyer and the women from the 1920s, it was almost impossible to find primary resources or anything really written about Lucy Wanzer, even though she had this huge impact on the San Francisco medical community. So I was just like, okay, she's got to be the next person I write. And she's actually not the main character, but she actually forms her sort of background, forms the mentor character in Across a Broken Shore. And that's basically Willa's story. She's an 18-year-old girl. She's the youngest girl in an Irish Catholic family, and her parents expect her to be a nun, but she really wants to be a doctor. She has medical texts that she's hidden underneath her bed. And one of her brothers, she's one of 5. She has 4 older brothers, and one of her brothers has an accident, and she comes to discover that there's a female physician living in her neighborhood. And so she sneaks out during the day to go sort of be apprenticed to this female physician, who just so happens to also be taking care of the men who are building the Golden Gate Bridge. So all the history of building the bridge and the changing and shifting of how the bridge goes kind of parallels to Willa's change in her life and her dream to sort of be a doctor. So it was really fun to sort of parallel those two sort of arcs of, this great monument being built along with her story of her changing and growing too. So yeah, that was a huge undertaking. I spent a lot of time in the weeds studying everything you would want to know about the Golden Gate Bridge. So
okay, so you got to throw us something. What did you learn? Something you learned that was like, oh my gosh, I never know that.
I think the coolest thing I learned was the Golden Gate Bridge was the first bridge that had a lot of safety measures added to it when it was being built. So the Bay Bridge was built before the Golden Gate. And how people would figure it out is like, it's horrible to say, but they would say like for every like $1 million spent, they would lose a worker. I mean, it was just like somebody would perish, and it was just this crazy thing. And so the gentleman, and of course now I'm going to totally forget his name, but the gentleman who was basically head of the work site, they actually built like this trapeze nets that was underneath the bridge once the structure was up. And the net was underneath the bridge. And so men who were working on the side, doing drilling and all this crazy stuff, if something should happen, they could actually be caught in the net versus falling like the 250 feet into the water to their death. So that was, again, just very interesting things like this, all the safety measures. There happened to be an incident where like a lot of the steel workers, the guys that were working actually inside the vaulted structures as they were like putting in the bolts and all this kind of stuff, they started having these issues where like their hair was falling out, their teeth was falling out. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And they figured out that the melting paint was causing like this horrible, like, exhaust. And so they were like basically being poisoned. And so that was the first time they started using like the respirators and stuff like that. So, interesting little things about that you just see the bridge and you think there's just this amazing structure, but so much learning and so much, and right before the bridge actually opened, they had a pretty big accident, which is the biggest loss fatality of life. What happened was one of the steel girders kind of came off one of the stanchions that they stood on to sort of work on the sides of the bridge. It came loose and it took a bunch of guys down actually into the net, and the net let go and they all went down into the water. So they lost several workers that way. But that was like the biggest incident they had, as far as loss of life and stuff like that. So just like fascinating stories. I listened to like a lot of like audio from men who were on the bridge that day, and read a lot of primary sources just about how the bridge was built. And it's just an extraordinary feat of engineering if you think about all the structures that are built like underneath the water that actually help to hold up that bridge. It's pretty amazing. So pretty cool.
I love history. I love details.
Yeah.
Because then you feel like you're there, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any tricks for authors as they're writing to help put a reader into the story at all? What can you teach us?
I mean, I think personal, and I know not everybody can do this, but like personal firsthand experience is important. Like, I happen to find somebody who actually owned a biplane. So like I actually got into it and climbed around it and sat in the back seat and tried to like figure out what that would feel like to be sitting in the back of that seat. For the Golden Gate, for the Across the Broken Shore, I actually walked from one end to the other of the Golden Gate, and I actually just stood there and thought about like what it felt like to stand on the side of the bridge and look down that far into the water, and what those men would have been thinking about, and all these like sort of sensory ideas, because I'm a very visceral writer. I try to really include all the senses in my writing. So if you're somewhere, I hope you can smell it, touch it, feel it, hear it. That's a really big deal to me. So primary sources, really important, especially if you can get, and not only stuff just written, but if you can actually hear the people's voices, if you can hear their actual stories, really important. And then if you have this capability of actually being there, like my book I have on Sub is it's a New York-based book. It's a Gilded Age book. And I went to New York and I walked a lot of the places and went to a lot of places that are actually like real spots that happen in the story, because I wanted to be able to, explain them and talk about them and, actually take the reader there and feel like they were actually standing like next to the characters as I'm explaining them. So as much like visceral detail as you can get about an experience or about a place, I think that really helps in your storytelling.
Is there a danger of having too much detail?
Well, yeah, there is. And that's why you hope you have a really good editor, because I love to tend, like, I really, for some reason, I don't know what it is, but I happen to have these small little lucky things that happen to me when I write books, and like certain things have actually happened in that time period that I can actually play off of. Like, I didn't know this, but like where I set the book in Lincoln, Nebraska, Nothing But Sky, that was like actually where like Charles Lindbergh like first started training, and you know what I mean? So I kind of played with that a lot. And there's a part of the book where it takes place in Chicago, and that's actually where Bessie Coleman was from. Bessie Coleman was the first African-American woman to get her pilot's license. She actually had to get it in England and then come back. But France, I can't remember. But
Wow.
yeah. And so but these were like things I didn't know about. And then when I started researching these characters, I was like, oh my God, those people were actually there. Like, I can work them into the story. And so having those sort of cool little like coincidences, but being able to include them is a big deal. But you can also get really in the weeds with that. So a lot of times, like, especially in the book I just wrote, like, I have so many cool little, like, New York little tidbits that I wanted to add. And my agent, God bless her, was like, okay, I love that you know this much, but like 4 paragraphs about like this, like one building is maybe a little too much. So it's ruining the pacing. So maybe you need to bring back that a little bit. So yes, but I would rather tend to overwrite and have somebody like that pull me back than not have enough setting detail and have people read it and be like, I just didn't feel like I was there or whatever. So it is a delicate balance.
Okay, so as you're talking, Amy, I just had a tap on my shoulder from a listener who just went, Dave, ask her about pacing, please, because I'm not really sure how to do that or what that takes.
Yeah,
Can you kind of just unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So I think pacing is, I mean, I wish it was something that you could say, oh, X, Y, and Z, you know, ABC is how you do pacing. But what I always tell people is that if you are reading a scene or something happens and you're pausing or your brain is going off the page, or if you're distracted by something, that means that you haven't kept the reader engaged. So pacing is basically moving the story along in a way that you can bring the reader with you. So pacing means continuing to keep interest, continuing to keep conflict on the page, continuing to keep dialogue, keeping the story moving forward. And if any of that is dragging, then you're basically slowing the pacing in a story. So I would what I always tell people when they're asking me about craft questions for pacing is I always encourage people to, like, when they're at a point where they're ready to almost send a book off to their agent, to like sit down and actually either read the story back out loud to yourself, or there are text to speech things that you can do on your computer that you can hear it and you can hear the rhythm of the sentences and stuff like that. And when you have that sort of different sort of visceral experience, when you're seeing it or hearing it in a different way, you sort of see those places where the story is slowing down. And that kind of tells you, okay, maybe I need to cut a line or two, cut a paragraph, that type of thing.
So the one thing I hear from people a lot, Amy, is that we don't write like we talk, we don't talk like we write.
Right.
Do you use those as two different levers when you're writing, where you want to be more about how you talk or you want to be more about how you write? Do you kind of use them both, or do you prefer one over the other?
I think that there's a delicate balance between dialogue and internal VOV. And sometimes that's really hard as a beginning writer to know that. Like, I'll see a lot of times where I will read for somebody who's newer to the craft, and you hear a lot of internal narrative and the dialogue is super stilted. And I think it's just more of allowing yourself to think about what are the intonations of dialogue for people. Like, I think one of the things that people always think is that when you write dialogue, you have to write in complete sentences. But if you've ever listened to somebody's conversation, nobody talks in complete sentences when you're having a dialogue, right? People are interjecting, people are talking in clauses, they're trying to get their point across in sort of stilted ways sometimes. And so you have to think about that in as far as like the voice of your characters talk. So if you have a character who's a super fast talker, their sentences are going to be really sharp and quick. Where if you have somebody who is just, loves to hear themselves talk and is very much like a detailed storyteller, you're going to allow their sentences to be a little bit longer and be filled with clauses and stuff like that. So you have to think about it in terms of what the characters, who the characters are, what they're sharing. But where I think people get lost with dialogue is dialogue should not be, a conversation. Dialogue should be, what am I doing to move the story forward? What details am I giving the reader in that conversation that continue to pace the story forward? And I think if you're looking at those types of things as you're reading and you're critiquing yourself and you're editing yourself, those are things that will really help you, help with that internal narrative and help with that dialogue process.
Okay. Let's jump back over to Meet Me at Ivy Falls.
Sure.
In Ivy Falls, sorry.
Yep.
For this one, could you describe the ideal reader for this book? Like, I'm thinking, like, I'm a listener to this, and I want to fall in love with a great new book.
Yeah.
I want to take it down to the beach or out into the August heat in Phoenix, and I want to melt outside while I read a book.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of the story here?
Sure. Well? So this book would be considered contemporary romance, small town romance. It's second chance romance. The two main characters are ex-childhood sweethearts who haven't seen each other in 10 years. The female main character is a contractor. She does predominantly restoration of old homes. Ivy Falls is an old southern town, and her sort of thing is that she's come back to town because of some various familial situations, and so she's back in town, and she's discovered that a lot of the historical homes in town are either being knocked down or have gone to pot. And so she basically says, I'm not going to let this happen. Like, I'm going to start restoring the smaller houses that I can. And she has one specific house in mind that she really wants. And she goes to the auction and she thinks she has the house. And at the last minute, it gets bid away from her and she ends up turning around. And it's her ex-childhood sweetheart who she hasn't seen in 10 years. And she's, furious because, first of all, she hasn't seen him. And now he's taken her house and he doesn't know anything about renovation or restoration or anything. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for this sort of like what I'd like to call like forced proximity, uneasy alliance type of thing, because he's gotten himself into this situation that he needs her help or he's never going to be able to fix the house. So they're sort of forced together, even though they both have secrets that they're keeping from each other and why they've been apart for so long. So it's very much that, I like to write like snarky sort of, banter between characters, and they definitely have a lot of that because they have a lot of past and a lot of like frustration and anger between them because they're not telling each other the whole truth. And then combined with all of that are all these like funny little people who live in town. So my publisher likes to call it sort of like Gilmore Girls meets Virgin River or Colleen Hoover. It's got serious issues in it, but it also has a lot of comedic relief from the wild, kind of quirky people who live in town who stick their noses in places, that shouldn't be and very much are attuned to the town gossip. So there's a line actually in the second book that's like, this town, everybody's business is everybody's business. Everybody knows about it. So, but there's lots of love there. And even though people, tend to be a little nosy, it's done out of love and care for everybody in town. So it's got a very small town feel to it.
I grew up in a small town, and I feel like I'm doing a John Cougar Mellencamp song right now, but I did grow up in a small town, and I remember somebody, when we first moved there as a family, a random person from the community came to our house, brought us treats or whatever, and they said, if you haven't heard a rumor by noon, you have to start one. And we're like, okay. They're like, yeah. And we roll up the sidewalks at 6 p.m., just so you know. And we're looking at each other like, really? They're like, no. So I love small towns. Yeah. I love small town.
I grew up in a small town in Southern California, which is, I'm sure people don't think there's small towns in Southern California, but I grew up in a small town in Southern California. And the thing that I remember most about it is that and I'm going to age myself here, but I was of the time frame where like it was like summer and you put on like a bathing suit and a t-shirt and shorts and you got on your bike and you rode off to your friend's house and you hole hopped and you did all this stuff. And the whole thing was you would ride down the street and like moms would call out the window, your mother's looking for you, go home. You know what I mean? Like everybody knew who you were and, you had to be home by like the time the street lights went on. And if you weren't, people would drive down the street and roll down their windows and be like, it's time to go home, type of thing. Everybody knows everybody else's kids. And so it's just very funny and cute. Yep.
Yeah, and you didn't have how many friends or how many likes did you have on your social media. It was how many bicycles were on your front yard.
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
how you knew, right?
Exactly, yeah. Or how many times like everybody had to call car because everybody was in the street, playing like, jumping their bikes or playing football or whatever it was, or like in the front yard, filling up water balloons or whatever it was. So it was pretty funny.
So Ivy Falls is perfect for anybody who likes to renovate old homes, fall in love possibly with a former great friend and love of your life. So it's going to be interesting. So you said there's going to be 3 books in the series?
They are, yeah.
Okay, so, wow, there's going to be lots for us to read then, right, for these 3?
Yeah, and each book is like sort of a little bit of a standalone, but it follows a character that you meet, or it follows a couple you meet in the first book. So that's the interesting thing about writing. This is my first series, so writing a first book has a lot of heavy lifting, right? Because you've got to set up the town, and you've got to set up, this feeling and this vibe of this town, and then, have it kind of stay the same and have it still have that same feel through all 3 books. So the first book is, basically introducing the cast of characters. And then how we have it planned out is that for the 2 books following that, it will follow 2 other characters in town.
Any of your characters in Meet Me in Ivy Falls surprise you as an author as you're writing them? I didn't anticipate this character to go in this direction, and I'm delighted.
It's so funny because, and it's hard to talk about this with people. I'm sure your listeners will appreciate it because if they, they enjoy writing and the craft of writing. But if you talk about this with anybody else, they kind of look at you strange. But there's a zone you get into when you write, and who your characters are. But as you start to write them, or you start to give them dialogue, or you start to give them narrative, at least for me, and I'm sure there are a lot of authors who feel this way too, my characters just sort of start to talk to me. Mm-hmm. And I'll be writing something, and all of a sudden, like this line will pop into my head, and I'll just type it out, and then I stop, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, where did that come from? Like, I thank you for telling me that. I didn't know that about your backstory, but now that backstory explains a lot, So my characters, at least, I have a pretty good idea of who they are. I have a pretty good idea of who their backstory is. But there are always these little sort of nuggets of things that just show up as I'm like in the zone for writing. So there's one little like funny little tidbit in this book. There's a very Gilmore Girls-esque scene towards the end, and there's a town hall meeting, and like there's this whole thing that goes on about like this whole other conversation before they get to the important part of the conversation. And I hadn't planned it. I was like, actually that scene was not in the original draft. Like my editor basically said, I need you to take me back into the town one more time. We need to really establish the town. And so I had to write this brand new scene. And I was like, okay, well, we'll have a town hall meeting. And something came up in the town hall meeting, and I don't want to spoil it for your readers, but there's this really funny conversation that happens. And after I had written the whole thing in like a frenzy, like my fingers could not keep up on the keyboard, I went back and read it, and I was just laughing so hard. And I'm like, okay, brain, I have no idea where that came from, but that was really funny. So thank you. So like, little things like that where you just like let your imagination run wild, and you can have so much fun. In book 2, there's a line in book 2, and I've always wanted to write like a line that like that somebody may want to get as a tattoo one day. That's a really strange author thing to want to do, but I had this one really poignant line from my male character in book 2 that is actually a tattoo that he has on him. And I just figured out the backstory behind it. And I was like, wow, like, I was like, I don't know where that came from. That the line for it just totally popped into my head. But I was like, every time I read it now, I sort of like tear up because I'm like, wow, I don't know where that line came from. But when my fingers were on the keys, it just sort of came to me. So yes, there are lots of fun things about writing that sometimes your characters just sort of whisper in your ears, what their wound is or what they're fighting. And it's sort of just fun to go along for the ride.
You're kind of a reader in that moment as well. You're along for the ride.
Oh, right? Definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about being a writer too, is that so much of the time that you're a writer, you're fighting that imposter syndrome, right? I don't care how accomplished you are. I don't care how many New York Times bestsellers. I don't care how many copies you've sold. It's something that we all fight as just artists. And so when you get to a moment where you have a chapter like that or you have a scene like that, and then you're like, okay, this reminds me of the reason why I torture myself and why I do this, because it's for moments like that that just feel like magic.
Any tips for authors around world building at all? Is there anything that you've found that works for you?
I think world building, it's different for everything, right? Like if you're going to write fantasy, that's going to be a totally different set of rules. But I feel like even when you write contemporary or even when you write historical, there has to be certain elements that the reader identifies with. The things that they understand, that they can settle themselves into. Sort of back to, if we're going to round back, kind of circle back to earlier in the conversation, it's the idea of putting the character in the actual setting. So in Ivy Falls, they have this small little like village downtown area. And so my fun thing is like for every season, there's always like a new smell coming out of like the dairy dip or the new smell that's coming out of like the bakery, and it kind of changes with the season. So really sort of leaning into how you can sort of grab that reader and not only, tell them on the page, which, is this, showing versus telling thing, but also like letting them feel like they're actually there with the character. And I love to use this example a lot, which is in Nothing But Sky, my first book, there's a scene where my main character, Grace, is actually 500 feet up in the air and she's standing on the edge of the wing. And I had to think to myself, like, what would the wind feel like? What would the smell of the exhaust and the smoke coming off the engine smell like? What would the air smell like? All these sort of things, how would her adrenaline be pumping? Would her heart be beating out of her chest? And is it, or is the blood racing in her ears? All these crazy things. And I think the more specific detail you can give to a setting, that you can actually immerse the reader in that actually particular place and then a particular time really helps to kind of do that world building. And even when you're not, writing this high fantasy, which requires all this specific world detail building, even when you're writing contemporary, you still need to add those elements of detail to really make the reader feel like they're embedded in that scene with you.
As you're describing this, what came to my mind, Amy, is like a rock climber climbing a stone wall.
Yeah.
They need those little foot spots to put their feet and where they put their hands.
Yeah.
And in writing, you kind of have to create those elements where they can actually climb through the story, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I just thinking you saying that. I mean, I'm like, as soon as you said that, I like kind of scrunched my toes together because I think about because I think about like pushing your toes up into those small little like notches, right? To have good places and like your nails sort of scratching on the wall, trying to, get purchased and all this kind of stuff. And those are the types of things I think that really like bring a scene alive. So when I'm talking to even younger writers, they'll say, oh, well, I'm in the kitchen, writing a story with my mom, or my mom's helping me with the characters helping the mom characters helping the character. I'm like, well, what's going on in the kitchen? Like, is mom baking something? Is somebody coming in the door? Are the windows open? Can you smell what's coming in? Are the drapes fluttering? So just those small little details that help ground that reader in the scene is really, really helpful.
Yeah, it's good. Because when I think of it, when an author says something like, I walked into my grandmother's kitchen and she was making pie. Okay, so for me, my mental picture of my grandmother making pie could be completely different than the author's picture.
Right.
Because I'm in my grandmother's kitchen and they're in their grandmother's kitchen.
Right.
So I'm seeing the steam on the windows. There's pies everywhere.
Yeah.
It's chaos. The timer's going off because the pie's ready, and the heat in the room and all that. So I'm in my own version of that. So I don't need like super detailed version of your kitchen.
Right.
Because I want to go to my kitchen. Right.
But there's a writing craft tip in that though too, right? Instead of the showing versus telling, like, is she making peach pie? Is she making strawberry pie? Is she making blueberry pie? That's all going to tell you sort of like where it's taking place, right? Because the peach pie is probably going to be Georgia, right? Something that's more southern, versus, maybe another part of the country or, where blueberries are, bloom during the summer. So it's being able to take those small little details and then just sort of give that extra oomph to the reader so that you, like I said, ground them in that scene. So
smart.
Yeah.
I'm learning a lot from you, Amy. This is really good. Okay, so congratulations on the new book and more books to come.
Thank you.
I have one more question for you here at the end, but before we do that, where do we go? I'm going to have links for all your websites in the show notes.
Perfect.
Where do we go for your website? And maybe where are you most active on social media as well?
Sure. My website is Amy. You can get to it either through amytrueauthor.com or amytruebloodauthor.com. You've seen there on the website, I kind of have them split between the two. I'm most active on Instagram and on Threads as at A True Books. I'm also on TikTok at A True Books. I just do some small stuff on there, but most active on Instagram and Threads. The U.S. paperback of Meet Me in Ivy Falls is out now. The U.K. paperback and the ebook come out this Thursday, which would be July 4th, but we'll be recording this or you'll be letting this go some other time, so I'll just say July 4th. And then also, it looks like I just found this out. The audiobook will be available in September sometime, so be looking for that too on Audible and all the places where you buy your lovely audiobooks.
Amazing. Okay, so as we go, that's a great segue for me because I wanted to ask you about that. Do you voice your own audiobooks or do you hire an actor to do so?
Gosh, no. I have the skill sets, and audiobook narration is not part of that skill set. I still answer the phone sometimes. As your readers probably know, I have a very high voice, so not very tall. So sometimes now, even when I answer the phone, people are like, "Can I speak to your mother?" Type of thing. So I do not have an audiobook narrator voice. No, I am lucky enough that the companies that I work for, they sort of provide narrator auditions or little clips, and then I get to listen to those, and then we kind of figure out together who we're going to hire. So Meet Me in Ivy Falls is dual POV, male and female, so I will have a male narrator and a female narrator who will do the dual POV. And then Nothing But Sky has an audiobook, and that's a single female POV, excuse me. So no, I do not narrate audiobooks. No, that is not in my skill set.
It's got to be an interesting experience to hear the voice of your character as well, to actually have a human voice behind that. That's going to be an interesting experience.
I will be very vulnerable in this moment. So the first time I heard the audiobook for Nothing But Sky, I got through the first chapter and I had to stop because I was crying. Because it's not crying like sad tears, but crying happy tears. Because if you've been working at this for a really long time, and I mean, I just have stacks and stacks of rejections, and you always sort of get to this moment when you're in that journey where you kind of question, why am I doing this? And will anybody ever read my work? And then you hear somebody professionally bring your characters to life, and you hear them give them that perfect intonation in a scene that just matches your comedic humor, or they're in a very vulnerable moment, and you just hear that sort of creak in the narrator's voice, and you just think, oh my gosh, I cannot believe these are actually the words that I put on the page, and that this person is actually saying them and sharing them with listeners is an amazing thing. So every time I get it's two things. Every time I get an audiobook, it's a joy. And then whenever I see my book in a library, it's a big deal. Libraries were a really big deal in my house when I was a kid. I'm the youngest of 5. So my mom spent a lot of time trying to keep us busy. And the libraries in the summer were a big part of my childhood. So to see my book in a library for the first time, I also cried. It was like a really big deal. It was a very full circle moment for me. So you go through a lot as a writer, but there are also very joyful moments too. And the audiobook was one of them for me, that's for sure.
Excellent, Amy. Thank you so much for doing this. Sure. For the audience listening, please go buy Amy's books. There's lots to choose from here, everyone. And if you're a pilot, there's a book for you. If you've ever been on a bridge, there's a book for you. Yep. If you've ever wanted to renovate a home, there's a book for you. There's lots for you here. Amy's got you covered. Yep. I would encourage you to, when you buy the books as a listener as well, please leave a very detailed and an amazing review for Amy. Yes, please. That does help all of our authors to get in front of more potential buyers for the books. And that's your part to play as a purchaser of Amy's books. Please do that. I know that Amy would really appreciate to hear your kind and thoughtful words about her work. So, Amy, thank you so much for being part of the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
You got to come back in the future as we celebrate more books, okay?
I would love to do that.
Okay, everyone, all the information in the show notes as always. Amy, thank you so much. Hey, thanks for listening to Living the Next Chapter. I'm glad you stayed all the way to the end. You're my new bestie. And the one thing I like to do with my besties is enjoy time together over a cup of coffee. Now, one thing missing in the equation is my coffee cup is empty. And what I would love if, after 390 plus episodes roughly, if you found any value in the podcast and you want to say, hey Dave, do you need a refill of your coffee cup? I'm looking at it right now, and you know what? It's looking kind of sad. There's not much in the coffee cup. If you want to help support the podcast, I would love you forever as besties and celebrate coffee with you. You can celebrate and support the show at our website using our Buy Me a Coffee link. And all the money goes back into the podcast. And we also like to give it to other podcasters. So if you want to support the show, head over to livingthenextchapter.com and let's top it up. Thank you guys. Thanks for listening. Cheers.